I must admit to a certain amount of pride as I watched two of my sons, Paul and Herbert, take over management of the Barton Ranch. The two became both entrepreneurs and inventors. They constructed a prune dipper and a dehydrator to process the prunes, and they joined other growers in associations that would later become sunsweet growers and diamond walnut growers. I beamed with pride in the spring of 1931 when Paul married Alice Lee Hall of Stockton, a secretary for the mayor's business. By the fall of that year, Alice had delved into the ranch life wholeheartedly. So we were all deeply concerned when she contracted blood poisoning caused by hulling walnuts by hand.
And that was my father's inspiration to try to build a machine. My cousin Grace tells me that my uncle's inspiration was to do something better than the existing technology. So they built that huller. It was highly successful. It had far more capacity than anything that was available up to that point, and it launched a manufacturing business here on the ranch. My uncle was educated as an engineer at the University of Arkansas. My dad had an 8th grade education because of impaired hearing, which caused him to drop out of school during his first year in high school. It was an interesting convergence, I guess, of talents, in that my uncle had certainly the technical education, whereas my dad drafted into the Army during World War I, but was discharged 5 weeks later when they realized that he could not hear. And so he went to work for Holt Brothers in Stockton, which is the predecessor company for Caterpillar Tractor. And he actually worked on the first tank that was used during World War I. So he developed fabrication skills. He learned how to weld. He learned how to be a machinist. And so he had practical knowledge that, when combined with my uncle's education as an engineer, resulted in a partnership that developed the first Barton walnut huller.
I and everyone else were excited in the spring of 1932 when Paul and Alice welcomed their first son, Hugh, to the ranch. And in early 1934, Jerry was born. He was the last of my grandsons. In 1934, the Barton Brothers manufacturing business was booming. Growers from throughout the area hired my sons to build Barton hullers. Prune prices plummeted during the Great Depression, and my sons removed many prune trees to plant more walnuts. But it was the manufacturing business that kept the ranch going. I thought 130 acres was difficult to handle, but Paul and Herbert opted to expand in 1943 and purchased 85 more acres adjacent to the Escalon Ranch. I didn't know what they'd do with that brushland, which became known as the BB Ranch, but my sons planted pumpkins, watermelons, squash, and other crops that they raised for seeds. And to no one's surprise, Paul and Herbert invented a seed harvester that they sold to Lawrence Robinson Seed Company in Modesto.
It was just a lot of fun as a kid to watch something go in a machine like a watermelon and come out with clean seeds in a hopper at the end of the machine. But these guys were incredibly ingenious mechanically.
I recall looking upon the earth, wondering if it would survive the bloodshed of World War II. That's when Kango Matori, a neighboring farmer, was forced to leave his ranch and take his family to a relocation center. He left his tractor with the Bartons. Attaching a cable mechanism to the tractor, Paul and Herbert invented a tree shaker to dislodge prunes and walnuts from the trees. And yet another product was added to Barton manufacturing. Shakers used today are descendants of the Barton tree shaker. Following World War II, my son Herbert decided to leave the ranch and sold his interest to Paul and Alice. I watched as Paul removed all of the prune trees I had planted in favor of more walnuts. It was also about this time that my son figured his two sons needed to go to work.
My father believed that my brother and I should be kept busy, and so we had chores, I suppose, began when we were very young, gathering eggs and working in the garden with my grandmother. And then when I was 6 years old, I had my first outside job working in a dry yard owned by a neighbor about a mile and a half, 2 miles away. And that progressed to, was cutting peaches, cutting apricots, and then we harvested grapes, and then the prune harvest would start. And when we got home from school, we had chores. When I was 10 years old, my dad set us up with some cows, and we milked cows and took care of different types of livestock. All of these activities resulted in developing a bank account that would get us through college.
Looking at the rings from the grandfather tree, I am surprised that those from the 1950s don't reflect the stresses everyone went through. I could only look on in horror as flood after flood devastated the ranch. The first came in 1950 and left the ranch in shambles. In 1955, while Jerry was in his final year at Stanford, another devastating flood struck. The 1950s saw 3 major floods nearly destroy my beloved ranch. Soil erosion exposed the roots, meaning a freeze could kill the trees. Levees were broken and had to be restored. Trash debris was littered everywhere. Still, Paul, Jerry, and the always excellent ranch hands persevered. And there were sure some happy times as well. In 1954, Hugh graduated from Cal and married Sheila Grieve. He was as fortunate as I was when I married my Lizzie. In 55, Jerry graduated from Stanford and married Janet. He too was fortunate, but Janet took some convincing.
In the early 50s, I said to my girlfriends and then my sorority sisters, there is one thing I know for sure, I will never marry a farmer. And in 1955, I married a farmer. And all these many years later, I can say it's been the greatest life that anybody could live.
In 1956, the ranch was expanded by 49 acres. But Jerry's contributions to the ranch were curtailed when he was drafted into the Army. I burst with pride when my great-grandson Don was born at Fort MacArthur. In 1958, when Jerry returned from the service, Paul was still tinkering with his inventions, this time inventing the Barton pruning tower. In 1959, Jerry and Janet made me proud again with the birth of another grandson, Gary. But sorrow struck the Barton Ranch in 1961, when my dear son Paul succumbed to cancer at the age of 66. It certainly left a big hole for Jerry and Hugh to fill.
The guy was kind of a mechanical genius, not a lot of education because of his hearing deficiency, but a smart guy, and was able to sort of wade into the junk pile and come up with a machine that ultimately became kind of the financial backbone, I think, for a number of years of the family business.
Happy times returned, especially in 1963, with the arrival of yet another great-grandson, Brent. The ebb and flow of the Barton Ranch took major downturns again, with devastating floods in both 1964 and 1969. Only this time, the local ranchers took action. By early 1965, 9 local growers and dairymen met in the Barton Ranch office to form the Stanislaus River Flood Control Association, whose main purpose it was to push for the construction of New Malonis Dam.
And it came about because a neighbor upstream from me, near Oakdale, came walking in one day and said, "Jerry, we can't take this anymore." And I said, Silvio, let's just get a bunch of growers together and see what we can do.
The local congressman was sympathetic to their cause, and funding to construct the dam was procured. But for the next 15 years, even as the dam was being built, the association and its attorney, Tom Shepard, continually fought and defeated many legal actions, including one that went all the way to the Supreme Court. Then came Proposition 17.
There was a statewide proposition in which a group called Friends of the River, who were composed of the commercial rafting groups that used 9 miles of white water on the Stanislaus, as well as the Sierra Club and the Environmental Defense Fund, put a proposition before the people of California to stop the construction of New Maloney's Dam. And I give a lot of credit to two individuals, Tom Shepard and John Hurdle, for their leadership in convincing all but one of the major newspapers in California to oppose this proposition. And the people of California voted 53 to 47% against this proposition so that the dam could go forward. And so we've been very blessed and very fortunate, but that is the last major dam constructed in California.